Seizing a temporary moment of respite, more than 160 civilian cars flee Mariupol, home to the worst humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. But some 400,000 inhabitants remain trapped there with no running water or heat and scarce food supplies. The capital, meanwhile, remains on edge. I'll speak to our reporter in Kyiv for the details. With each passing day of Russia's war on Ukraine, the refugee crisis continues to grow. Some 2.8 million people have fled the country, while an additional 2 million are now internally displaced, according to the UN. And a 4-second break from the Kremlin's tightly controlled narrative of the war in Ukraine, an employee turned anti-war protester interrupts a live TV bulletin on Russia's Channel 1, risking up to 15 years in prison. Thank you for joining us here on France 24. Also coming up in this bulletin, the likely dire effects of sanctions on Russia's economy are no secret. But the IMF has warned that Ukraine's economy, too, will suffer. The international organization saying the war could plunge the country into a devastating recession, projecting output could fall by as much as 10% this year. There's more to come in our business update. No progress, then, in the third round of peace talks between Russian and Ukrainian diplomats. This as deadly Russian strikes across Ukraine and the Kremlin threatening to take full control of major Ukrainian cities. Those are the two themes that marked the 19th day of the war, though a new round of negotiations is still planned later for Tuesday. In the Ukrainian capital, meanwhile, Russian airstrikes killed at least 2 people on Monday. The city remains heavily fortified, with only roads to the south remaining open. Local authorities have set up checkpoints, while the less than half of its originally 3 million residents continue preparing for the worst by stockpiling food and medicine. Well, for the latest, we'll cross to our reporter there, James Andre. Good morning, James. So where does the situation stand now in Kyiv?
Well, we've had a reasonable calm night here in Kiev, but we were woken up by an alert for an aerial bombing that was sent out by the authorities with asking the population to take cover. Now, there is one building that is on fire in northern Kiev. We don't have much more information, and detonations have been heard during the night there again in the northern parts of Kiev. Now, as you can see behind me, the city is still, of course, things are extremely calm here. Most of the shops that are behind me should be opening at this stage, but as you can see, that is not the case. Very few cars on the street, so indeed an eerie feeling of calm, with this feeling that everybody is waiting to see what will happen. Now, we've had the opportunity to speak to some people who are staying here in Kiev. One example was a lady we spoke to yesterday who told us that, well, she had no news of her husband who went to fight in the east, that she'd been sending messages to him for 9 days now without having any replies or with having no notifications that her messages had been read. But she is stuck here in Kiev in a high-rise building with her mother, that she cannot move because she is elderly. She's also taken in another old lady from a neighboring family, and with her 8-year-old son. So these are the stories of those staying here in Kiev. Of course, there are those who are also preparing for a fight. Yesterday, we saw some men digging trenches at a roundabout in northern Kiev, getting ready, piling sandbags in order to stop the advance of Russian troops entering the city. And of course, we are still having reports of much violence in Irpin, in the northwestern part of Kiev, and also in the northwestern part of Kiev, though the American Department of State says that for the time being, there is little advance of the Russian forces around Kiev.
And James, you on Monday were in Vasilkiv, a strategic city southwest of Kiev. What did you see there?
Yes, absolutely. Yesterday we were in Vasilkiv. Now, Vasilkiv is a very important city strategically because it is a garrison city, has been for hundreds of years, and it has many garrisons indeed, and a military airport. Now, 3 days ago, as we were traveling towards Kiev, this airport was hit by a barrage of missiles, 8 of them reportedly, and indeed these missiles are said to have totally destroyed this airport. Now, we wanted to go and see what the situation in town was. Now, what we found was a town that was indeed still functioning, maybe more than Kiev, with people on the streets, but also fighters of the voluntary popular forces preparing in official buildings across the city. We also visited a shelter that was ready to receive the population of the town. Now, this is a strategic town. Why? Because if the Russian forces want to encircle Kiev, they are going to have to take Vasilkiv, or at least go around it, in order to control the southern access to Kiev, because Vasilkiv controls 2 motorways that go down from Kiev towards the south, and those are the main lifelines to Kiev at the moment.
All right, James Andre reporting from the Ukrainian capital. Thank you very much for that update. Well, after 10 days of failed attempts to rescue civilians, there's hope on the horizon, at least for some residents of Mariupol. Russian soldiers allowed a first column of cars to escape the southern port city, which has suffered, of course, among the worst humanitarian impacts of the war. Kremlin forces nonetheless blocked an aid convoy from reaching the city, despite the still very desperate conditions there. Local officials say as many as 2,500 residents have been killed since the start of the war, while hundreds of thousands remain trapped without food, water, or electricity. Allison Sargent has more.
After some 2 weeks of constant Russian shelling, parts of Mariupol have been reduced to fields of rubble. This drone footage, provided by Ukraine's far-right Azov regiment, shows residential buildings up in flames. This apartment complex was just hit by artillery fire. A little girl cries out for her father, who may still be inside. Residents have barely had time to leave when again the sky rumbles overhead with the sound of Russian fighter jets, sending them running for cover back inside. A daily nightmare that's become too much to bear.
Papa, I can't take it anymore. We don't have any information. We know nothing. It's like we live in the middle of nowhere. They could at least tell us what's happening and where.
Without telephone or internet service, residents of Mariupol are completely cut off from the world, and no one understands why civilians are being targeted.
This was the school. Young children studied here. There were no soldiers. We don't know why it was hit.
One of the mayor's advisors said that Mariupol's last supermarket was destroyed just days ago, and that the city is out of supplies.
We haven't any water, we haven't any food now, and we haven't any electricity, we haven't heating, but the weather is freezing now. If we haven't any help, our people are dying.
On Monday, at least 160 cars were able to leave Mariupol for the first time, but a convoy of humanitarian aid has been unable to reach the city.